Hello, my beautiful grief growers, and welcome to another Facebook Live Monday. I hope you're all feeling as rested as you possibly can from daylight savings time, and that the time has not altered anything for you here. For those of us that practice daylight savings time, I suppose. So I'm saying hello to all those folks internationally that don't do the daylight savings time thing that we do here in America. But welcome. It's so good to have you here. Today I want to talk about an idea that I talked about on the podcast this week, and it's this concept of acknowledgement is not enough. And it's tricky phrasing, because coming into anything with being like, this is not enough, that is not enough, this is not enough, it can come off as seeming like criticizing, judging, analyzing, saying that the effort you're putting in is not good enough, is not worthy, is not valuable, is not going to get you to where you need to go. And that's not really quite what I'm saying today. But what I've noticed sometimes with grief stories, is that there's this tendency to acknowledge our pain, to see, hear, validate, give permission to our pain, all these things that we talk about as being so important in the grief process. And people admit that something's wrong. They say yes to the fact that something has changed. They say, I know that this is going on. I know that I am changing. I know that I'm hurt because of this. And then as a result of that, they do nothing. And there's this habit sometimes with acknowledgement, with seeing, with hearing, with validating, with giving permission to, of getting stuck in this little rut and never kind of bringing ourselves back out again. I'm getting into the hand motions again this week, which I totally love. So a huge, enormous part of grief is acknowledgement. There's so much resistance that we put up. I talked about this on episode 37 with Katie Scoggins. There's so much resistance that we put up to acknowledging after loss that our realities have changed, whether we've lost a job or a baby or a house or a spouse or a parent or a pet. There's this resistance to acknowledging that something has changed, because when we acknowledge something has changed, then we must also change, both emotionally, internally, and, as I'll get to later, externally. We must also bring different beliefs, practices, habits into the physical realm. And there's so much resistance already. So half of the battle, half of the work that I do through the podcast, coming back, through these Facebook Lives, through communicating with all of you, is working to get to this place where we can acknowledge, yes, something is different. Yes, something has changed. Yes, I cannot go back. I can only go forward. This acknowledgement, this seeing, hearing, validating, all of your feelings are normal. If you're so angry that you think you could kill someone, that's totally normal. If you're so sad you can't get out of bed, that's totally normal. If you're so numb that you can walk right out in the middle of the street and not care if you get hit by a car, that's totally normal. And just this validating, accepting, this massive acknowledgement, this umbrella of acknowledgement that takes place in the realm of grief is what breaks down this first wall of resistance. So don't get me wrong today. When I say acknowledgement is not enough, I'm not saying acknowledgement is not important, because acknowledgement is the first and the most vital step that we can use for ourselves on the road to coming back. This sitting with ourselves, with our kids, with our spouses, with our friends, with our coworkers, with our families, and saying something is different. We need to emotionally pivot. We need to acknowledge what's coming up for all of us here, and we need to be able to sit with it, to see all of it, to uncover it, to unearth it, to dive into it. All the cool jargon that you want to use with this is really super important. So acknowledging at the very beginning here that acknowledgement itself is very important. It's the very first step in coming back. But what I see so often with grief, and what's been coming up a lot in conversation for me, is the fact that people are acknowledging and thinking that that's all you have to do on your grief and loss journey, that when you acknowledge, you've done the work. And it's partially true. You've done part of the work. You've maybe done anywhere from 10 to 30% of the work, because the real work of coming back is action, in deciding what to do next, in reforming habits, in researching, outreaching for people with similar stories, starting to change what your day-to-day looks like. And this gets a lot scarier, because acknowledgement is dealing with what already exists, acknowledging what's bubbling under the surface, acknowledging what you're carrying around in your head every day, really examining what your heart is holding. But the process of action, which comes after acknowledgement, is a little bit scarier and a lot harder for people to get into sometimes, because It's the process of new creation. It's doing things you've never done before, or redoing them in a different way now that your loved one is gone, or that you don't have this job security, or you're not in this home, or you're no longer pregnant. Like, it's this whole different transformation of being something new, creating something new, manifesting something new into physical existence, whether it's through moving your body physically somewhere different, moving to a different house, different space, having new conversations, maybe a new therapist, a new support group, picking up a new book, new pieces of information, choosing to absorb new pieces of information. There's a lot of new and novelty that happens with this action. But the purpose of action is to recalibrate you, your body, your mind, your habits into this world that you do not want to be living in. There's this book that I'm reading right now by Julia Samuel called Grief Works, and she is a mental health professional in the UK, and she has this sentence in one of her books, and it says, grief is the process of learning to live with a life that we do not want to be true. Learning to live with a reality that we refuse to be true. And yeah, that's what action is in all of this. First, we must acknowledge that this life that we don't want to be true, it's real, is what exists for us. But then grieving, this grief process, also includes action, taking physical action in the real human world where we can touch things and feel things and connect with people and reach out for things and move our physical body places. It's recalibrating to this reality that we never wanted to be true for ourselves. And that's why action is so important for us, because it gets us moving again. Because what happens when we don't acknowledge what's going on for us, or what happens when we don't act, when we acknowledge what we don't act, is we get stuck in this rut. We're going on this path, grief and loss happens, we get down here. Part of the step of coming up is acknowledgement. You're getting up a little bit, and then action takes you even further because you're coming back to the world again. But what happens when you acknowledge and do nothing else? You kind of continue to sit at this lower level plane. You don't move, I don't want to say move on, but you don't move forward with your loss. You don't continue this recalibration process. You stay stuck in this place where grief is centric. Grief is the center of your story. The loss is the center of your story, and the acknowledgement is the center of your story, as opposed to moving into a place where you start to integrate with everything and everyone around you, gathering resources, more stories of people with similar losses, talking to a therapist, forming new relationships, physically moving to a new spot in the world. So the challenge that can come in when you acknowledge but you do not act is you get stuck in a rut of complaining. I said on the podcast this week that the gift of acknowledgement can become the curse of complaining, and you all know who these people are. These are people who have chosen in some form or another, conscious or unconsciously, to stay where they are and acknowledging their shortcomings and acknowledging their grief and acknowledging their loss and acknowledging everything that has gone wrong, all the chaos that has happened to them, all the disaster that's surrounding them, and done nothing. They're sitting in this space of, I see it, but I'm not going to do anything about it. There's kind of this passivity here. There's a victim mentality that can come in, and that's where the gift of acknowledgement becomes the curse of complaining, where people are like, I know this is how I am. I know that this is a trigger for me. I know that this happened and totally effed my life up. I know that this totally screwed me over, and I know that my life is forever changed. But am I going to do anything about it? Am I bringing things into physical existence? Am I reaching for resources and more stories? No. And this is a really big deal in grief, because that 30% of the battle is acknowledging all these things that already exist inside us, that we are acknowledging, seeing, hearing, validating, giving permission to these things that have changed, that are now true for us, this heartbreak that exists, these new emotions that we maybe have never felt before. That acknowledgement is so powerful. And we need that. That's the first step in coming back. We can't take action until we've acknowledged. That's got to be step one. And I don't even want to start dividing grief into steps. That's a whole other debate we can have. But in order to start the process of coming back, we must acknowledge that something is going on. Something is different. Something has changed. Something is missing. Something is weird, different, chaotic, powerful. Some ground has fallen out from underneath us. But the second step in all of this, and this is where it really gets vital, is moving everything from this head work, heart work, into physical reality. This action. Where are we taking action? What are we changing? What are we adjusting? What are we calibrating? We don't have to do it right the first time. Maybe the first book we read on grief isn't the one that resonates with us. Maybe we try and go to a support group and they're all crazy people, or they're much older than us, or they've had so many other losses that it feels heavy to take on their energy. But we're starting to move on the road. We're not life, loss, acknowledgement, and then just never coming back. It needs to be life, loss, acknowledgement, slow coming back, this action, these taking steps of coming back, learning who we are again after our losses, learning who we are without our loved ones, and learning who we are as people who are capable of coming back, capable of being these resilient people who can acknowledge we have the heart space and the head space for that, but we also have this physical strength, this physical capacity to choose what we want the remainder of our lives to be, even though we live in this reality that we don't want to be true. But acknowledgement is part of the battle, but it's not the whole thing. It's that first 10, 20, 30% that's so vital, but it's not everything. And I fear, grief growers, when I see people acknowledge but refuse to take action. I see people acknowledge, but they're scared to take action. I see people acknowledge, but they don't want to take action because they're afraid of losing memories. They're afraid they're dishonoring their loved one. They're afraid that their loss means nothing if they're capable of moving on. Like, if my life is good again, it means that this wasn't as bad as it actually was. And it's so not true. There's so many myths here that can resonate up in our brains. But it's so important to not get stuck in this rut of the gift of acknowledgement turning into the curse of complaining, this curse of being in a victim mentality, the curse of staying down here, when our hearts, when our spirits, when our minds, when the people around us know that we're capable of living so much more, being so much more, and doing so much more with our lives, taking action, acting on the things that have happened to us, because we're all capable of this recalibration at some point. We all have this in us. I so believe this to be true, that we all have this ability to come back, to recalibrate, to take action inside of us. And it's just it's so important, getting unstuck in grief. There's such a feeling of slogging through mud in iron boots, and these small actions, teeny little things, signing up for a daily email, watching these Facebook Lives, starting to say hello to people again on the street, letting your kids see you cry. How are you bringing this head work, this heart work, this thing that has struck you so strongly that you've acknowledged, how are you bringing that action into the physical world? How are you using it to come back? We want to use acknowledgement. We don't want to lean on it. We don't want to lean on our grief. At some point, and only you can decide what this is, but once you start feeling stuck, that's a pretty good cue. You decide when you're ready to start manifesting this heart work into the physical world. I absolutely adore you, my grief growers. I do. And just the fact that you're watching this video, the fact that you're in the Grief Growers Garden with me, the fact that you're on the podcast coming back with me, this is a sign that you're not just acknowledging anymore. You're searching for resources. You're starting to move. You're starting to act, to acknowledge. If you're feeling a call to do more, I would love to hear from you, whether that's in the private Facebook group, The Grief Growers Garden, or by email, shelby@shelbyforsythia.com. Let me know how I can help. I'm a person that can also help you unlock some of these acting motions. But that's all for this week. Acknowledgement is not enough. We must all act on our grief. Sending so much love your way, and I'll see you next time.